Hello, hello. Welcome to another Crypto Testers live show. And today I'm super excited because I have Chris Whinfrey with me. Chris is the founder of Hop Protocol. Hop is dedicated to building a multi-chain bridge. I think this is one of the most interesting areas of crypto at the moment. Basically, how you solve the question of letting users transport their assets between different layer ones, side chains, rollups, however they're called, and also how you let different apps on different chains interoperate so that they can communicate with one another. And how do you do all of this without going through centralized intermediaries like exchanges? Because that's not the end goal of crypto. So yeah, I'm super excited to have Chris on the show. And admittedly, I'm a bit biased in preferring to talk to Hop as one of these multi-chain solutions because I work with the Hop team. But I think, the whole topic is super interesting in and of itself. So I'm very, very glad to have Chris with me. With that being said, I'm going to pull him up. Hey, Chris.
Hey, Lido. Thanks for having me on the show. Really excited to be here.
Yeah, super excited as well. So I think maybe the best way to start this off is by talking about your past, right? I think many people who have been in crypto for a long time probably know you from Ethereum, which was one of the first smart contract wallets. So a wallet that had better security and better UX than normal Ethereum wallets like MetaMask, for example, and which got me really excited. And I think, that's also how we met. So explain maybe how you went from building this awesome wallet to pivoting to Hop, to building a protocol.
Sure. Yeah. So our team, like you said, was previously working on Ethereum. Ethereum was really targeted at, more casual Ethereum users. And so this is kind of like before we saw the big DeFi wave, onboarding was a huge problem for new users who didn't really know how to back up a seed phrase, get their first ETH and that kind of thing. And they just really wanted to kind of get started, see value from the blockchain. Yeah, just sign up with a username and password and get going as fast as possible. And so under the hood, we were using contract-based account to do this. And at the time, we were deploying one for every user. It cost us about 30 cents. And then, pretty quickly, we saw DeFi start to take off. That really drove up the gas prices with Ethereum. We pushed this cost of deploying the contract-based account over to the user because it just got too costly for us. But then pretty soon, it was too costly even for, regular users, who are looking at, even once they deployed this account, they're looking at over $100 just to make swaps through Uniswap. It costs, over $200 just to actually sign up and deploy this contract-based account. And we really saw all of the casual users on Ethereum temporarily get pushed out. And it really got dominated by just the more heavy DeFi users that were able to afford to pay these high transaction fees because, they're making it up and, by transacting with large amounts of money. And so, pretty quickly, we started looking at ways to kind of get our users onto layer 2 because they wanted to use Ethereum. They wanted to use dApps. It was just too expensive. So we integrated with a few layer 2s and, saw users start to use them. But we saw that users weren't really saving that much money because they would go to layer 2, they would make a few transactions, and then they would come back to layer 1. And they would actually pay more in bridging costs than they would if they just used the app on layer 1 because they would, bridge there, pay a layer 1 transaction fee, do a few transactions that were really cheap, and then bridge back and pay a layer 1 transaction fee. And so we realized that, if these casual users are going to use Ethereum and if Ethereum's really going to scale to, address mainstream users, that we needed users to not just get on layer 2, but especially if we're going to have many layer 2s or any different solutions, they needed to get onto layer 2 and stay on layer 2 and just never ever touch layer 1 and be able to jump directly from layer 2 to the next. And that's actually how we started working on Hop Protocol, was to address this problem for Ethereum users and create that true layer 2 native experience.
How long ago did you start working on Hop then?
It was end of 2020. So around Q3 2020, we started to ideate around it. We started working on proof of concept. This year, we released the Hop white paper and a prototype that kind of showed, what Hop could do, what the user interface could look like. And yeah, that got a lot of traction. We put that out. People seem to really like the concept. It's kind of this novel approach that no one's taken before. And we pretty quickly realized that, if Ethereum's going to scale with a rollup centric roadmap that, one, this was a big missing piece. How did these rollups kind of talk to each other, how value transferred between them? We realized that, maybe this could address, a bigger problem that what we're addressing with Ethereum, and could actually be this key piece of Ethereum infrastructure and actually, help Ethereum as a whole scale. So pretty quickly, we kind of, dropped what we were doing with Ethereum and we went heads down to kind of focus on Hop protocol, get the product out. 3 weeks ago, we launched our first bridge, USDC. We've hit over $10 million in cumulative volume so far, growing. We launched USDT yesterday, and yeah, things have just kind of snowballed from there.
Did you know that Hop would be like a standalone protocol, or did you first thought it would maybe be like a piece of Ethereum and just like started with a much smaller scope and then successively realized that this would be a big thing?
Yeah, at first we didn't. I think we knew that it could be like that it had that potential, but the idea was not to at the time was not to kind of like pivot away from Ethereum. It wasn't until things really gained traction and that we realized, it deserved our focus and, would need our full focus.
So, yeah, I mean, it must be an incredibly exciting moment to, just go to the whiteboard and start designing this super complex system. It's not just like another lending protocol or another, fork of Uniswap. You're building like a bridge that spans all the different rollups and side chains that make up the Ethereum ecosystem today. How did you go about that? What are the main challenges when you build a multi-chain bridge?
There's, a few approaches. We kind of started with atomic swaps that, atomic swaps have been around a while. That was kind of like the obvious first thing that we looked at. We moved on from that just because there's some issues once you go to decentralize the network, where you have these like griefing vectors that make it hard to really scale things up without being vulnerable to like denial of service attacks and things like that. And then we started looking at, how these rollups actually communicate. So each rollup has a message bridge between layer 2 and layer 1. That was kind of like eye-opening, was that, we can actually communicate from layer 2 to layer 1. And then we can actually use that to communicate from layer 2 to layer 2. Each of these bridges that the rollups have is called like a cross-domain message bridge. They all use different names for this thing, but that's what Optimism uses. And so kind of a naive approach to communicating from one layer 2 to the next layer 2 would be to send a message from layer 2 to layer 1 on one rollup, and then send that same message from layer 1 to layer 2 on the next rollup. From there, we just needed to figure out a way to make that scalable. Then we could do this kind of cross-chain bridging.
So Ethereum basically acts as this messaging hub where you send messages from one rollup to another, but since they don't have like a direct link between them, let's say between Optimism and Arbitrum, you use actually Ethereum to sort of broadcast the message back to the destination chain. Okay, so that was the eye-opening moment that you could do this.
The problem with the naive approach there is that every single message goes through layer 1, and then you kind of have the same scalability problem as just, exiting and then entering the next rollup, because you still have one layer 1 transaction per message. So what we could do from there is, and this is kind of like Hop's secret sauce and, how we achieve scalability, is that what we call a cross-domain message route. So this is kind of like a state route like you would have with a rollup where, it represents all of the state in the rollup with just a single hash. Our cross-domain message route can represent 1,000 messages with just a single hash. And so we can aggregate many messages on the source layer 2, turn that into just a very small piece of data. That small piece of data can propagate over the existing message bridges that the rollups provide, and then go down to layer 1 and then back up to the destination. Then we can unpack that cross-domain message route. That way we've sent, 1,000 messages from one rollup to the next rollup, but only passed a single message through layer 1. And this allows us to do this really scalable cross-domain messaging.
So you basically have a way to pack a lot of transactions into a small piece of data, and you become this messaging system between all of the different rollups. And essentially, the more transactions you get, the cheaper it becomes for every individual transactions, because the costs are socialized, well, the gas costs to post this piece of data on L1 is socialized among all of the transactions. So basically, the bigger hop becomes, the better it is.
Exactly. Yeah. That layer one transaction cost can be amortized over all of the message senders. And so it keeps costs really low for them. And kind of the more people sending messages, the faster we can run the bridge. And also the more scalable it becomes because, like you said, you can socialize that cost over more users.
And so, I mean, messages are one thing, right? But people want tokens. I mean, there's also, as we touched on before a little bit, the ability to like send messages to call one smart contract on one chain calling another smart contract. But I think the first application that get people excited is like sending tokens from one rollup or from one side chain to another. So how does this relate to the messages?
Each rollup has its own native bridge. And so, typically a rollup will first build this cross-domain messenger where they can have L1 contracts communicate with L2 contracts. And then on top of that, they'll build their native token bridge. And so the native token bridge basically just locks up tokens on layer one. So if you deposit DAI, it will lock it up in the rollup's native token bridge contract on layer one. And then they'll actually mint a representation of that DAI on layer two. And then it uses the cross-domain messenger to send the message to mint that representation of DAI. And then, likewise, when you withdraw, you can burn that representation and then claim the deposit in the layer one bridge contract.
So tokens are actually never really transferred in a sort of physical sense across like different networks. It's just messages that either mint tokens when the corresponding amount has been locked on L1, or they are burned when the reverse happens. But it's only conceptually we're transferring tokens, but we're just minting new tokens that represent the old token.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And so what we did with Hop was, since, just like how the rollups built this cross-domain messenger, and then the first application they built on the cross-domain messenger is their native token bridge, we built this cross-scaling solution message protocol. And then as the first application we built on top of this cross-scaling solution message protocol is a cross-scaling solution token bridge. And so we actually, also have a layer one bridge contract. You can deposit assets into this layer one bridge contract. A representation of that asset will be minted on a scaling solution. And then when you exit that scaling solution, you can burn that representation and exit to layer one. But you can also burn that representation and mint a new representation on a different scaling solution. So you actually then can bridge directly from one scaling solution to the next scaling solution. And then the messages still propagate through layer one in a scalable way and then eventually reach the destination. And I should note that all of this messaging, depending on the context, can be slow. So, layer one to layer two communication is pretty fast. That happens in around the time it takes for layer one to reach finality. So 5 to 10 minutes. But layer two to layer one communication, if you're dealing with an optimistic rollup, takes a full week. And with the ZK rollup, it's going to depend on how often it checkpoints. But basically, depending on the direction you're communicating, all this stuff can happen really slowly. And if the users want tokens, but not just they want tokens right now. They want it immediately. And so we use a liquidity provider in the system that actually can verify, a transfer is happening and actually bridge that liquidity gap and actually speed things up so that instead of taking a week to exit an optimistic rollup or to send from an optimistic rollup to a different scaling solution, the liquidity provider can actually make that happen immediately and just take a small fee for the services.
Okay. Let me pull that up because I once wrote a little article about Hop, and I have like this graphic. Maybe it helps to make it a bit more tangible. So you're saying there's a market maker, which is called the bonder, that essentially acts as a market maker. They see a transaction request that originates, let's say, on Optimism. Alice, the classical example, sends 1,000 USDC from Optimism. Let's not make it Ethereum. Let's make it like Arbitrum. And then the bonder sees that request, and if they see that this transaction is like valid, they can decide to advance or front the liquidity for Alice on her desired destination chain, so Arbitrum. So they can basically give Alice 1,000 USDC immediately at the destination chain so she can use them immediately. But then the bonder sits on a loan, basically a short-term loan, because they have advanced this cash, but they're not receiving it back immediately. They are not receiving it back immediately because for the hop system to know that this transfer that Alice made is valid, it needs a confirmation. It needs to reach finality on L1. And because, as we touched upon before, like Optimism, it only posts data back to L1 in with a large delay, I think 7 days. The bonder needs to wait for 6 days to get the 1,000 USDC back from the 1,000 USDC that they gave Alice back. Because they gave the loan on Arbitrum and not on L1, once the finality data reaches Ethereum, it's actually forwarded back to Arbitrum, because that's where the finality proof is needed, right? Because that's where the loan has been issued. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's exactly correct.
Okay. So it's basically the cycle of a bonder making short-term loans and then waiting for the system to reach finality, and the bonder just wants guarantees, or no, the system wants guarantees that the transfer from Alice was valid, and the bonder gets their money back a little bit later.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And we kind of think of it in two parts where, the transfer, Alice initiates the transfer, the bonder completes the transfer, and this happens pretty immediately, roughly the time it takes for the source chain to reach finality. So, about 5 to 10 minutes. And then there's the settlement process, which is what's actually using the layer 1 to layer 2 and layer 2 to layer 1 communication bridges, that cross-domain messenger, and using the cross-domain message route and actually propagating through layer 1. And we call that process the settlement process. And so the settlement process is kind of like the slow piece but is aggregated over potentially thousands of transfers and really gets the system the scalability aspect.
So we know that the time that the transfers on Optimism can reach finality, that takes 6 days. But in Hop, the bonders get the money back earlier than 6 days, right? So how does that work?
Yeah, so with Optimism, it's interesting because from an on-chain perspective, we need to wait 7 days for finality. But if you're an off-chain participant and you can actually see the order of these transactions, because all these transactions are posted on-chain on layer 1 and their order is guaranteed. And once their order is guaranteed, you can actually compute what these transactions do. Then you can actually know the state is final after layer 1 reaches finality. So basically, an off-chain participant has finality once the optimistic rollups transaction batch is submitted on layer 1, and then you wait some number of blocks after that to reach layer 1 finality. And so this is what the bonder does. Bonder needs to be an off-chain participant, waits for this off-chain finality, which happens pretty fast, and then completes the transfer. On-chain, we don't know what's the final state, because all we have is a state root that should be kind of what the final state is after some batch is computed, but we can't actually compute the batch on layer 1 because that part's like the really expensive part and is only done in case of a challenge. And so that's kind of like how optimistic rollups get their scalability. Because we can't have on-chain finality until after 7 days, then all of the messages coming from layer 2 to layer 1 can't be finalized until after 7 days. So what Hop does is we kind of have a different set of trade-offs than what an optimistic rollup has. So an optimistic rollup is going to have, millions of dollars. Most of those funds are going to be kind of like operating within the optimistic rollup itself. And any kind of security breach could compromise, the entire value of the rollup. And so as a bridge, we have a different security setup. So, one, we don't have as many assets as kind of like a full scaling solution itself. And then two, users are kind of only exposed for a limited period of time to the bridge, because, they use the bridge, they get funds at the destination, and then they no longer are exposed to the risk of the bridge. The parties that are kind of exposed to this risk are the liquidity providers. And so they're very sensitive to things like the time value of money and any kind of capital inefficiencies. Whereas participants that are actually on a roll-up and, they're lending, they're borrowing, they're trading, they're not worried about the exit time until they exit, because their funds basically aren't locked up on that layer 2. And so for Hop, it makes sense for us to actually use a shorter challenge time. So we use a day instead of a full week. And what a full week gets you is that extra time where in case you have, a large amount of validators or miners forming some kind of censorship attack on the chain that's preventing the honest participants from submitting fraud proofs that will actually show that there has been fraud. A full week lets you rally everyone up and you can actually do, a user activated hard fork and kind of fork out the malicious participants. Whereas, doing that within a day period would be much harder. And then it's also just harder to run a censorship attack for a full week. So it makes a lot of sense if you're kind of securing, hundreds of millions, billions of dollars of assets that aren't necessarily locked up. But for these kind of liquidity providers in the bridge, they're happy to kind of take on this long tail risk in order to have a 7 times more capital efficient exit time. So we basically shorten that exit period to 1 day. We use our own challenge mechanism where in case something is challenged, we just wait for the full challenge period. So we actually wait 2 weeks after that. And then we just see what the outcome of the optimistic rollup says and then base the resolution of our challenge mechanism on that outcome.
Okay. Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. So then we have this part of the Hop system explained. And then there's also another important component, right? Which is like the Hop intermediary token. And there, like a question that often comes up is like, why is it needed? The bonder makes sense. The bonder fronts liquidity at the destination chain. It's clear why it's needed. Otherwise it doesn't work. But like, why could the same system not go without this intermediary token, this Hop token?
And so the reason we have this intermediary asset is because ultimately we want to bridge to the tokens that come from the rollups native bridge. For the most part, some applications even built their own bridge, but basically there's going to be one version of each asset that's kind of like the canonical version. And this is going to be the version that, the Uniswaps adopt, the Aves adopt, the users adopt, and so on. But we can't necessarily, program in the logic we need to do this kind of cross-chain transfers into these native assets. And so that's why we have kind of this intermediary asset where we can program in the ability to kind of be burnt on one chain and then minted directly on another chain. This intermediary asset we call H token. So it's like HETH, HUSDC, HDAI. And each H token represents a deposit in the layer 1 Hop bridge contract. So if you have an HETH, you can claim it on layer 1 for 1 ETH. Then what we do, because, like I said, users don't want H tokens, they want the actual native assets or the canonical assets. So we deploy an AMM on each scaling solution that creates a market between the H token and the canonical token. And we use a stable swap AMM because these are like-kind assets. They should trade very closely in value. And that gives us, very low slippage at each of the endpoints. From a UI perspective, we actually abstract this intermediary asset, the H token, away completely. So if the users just wants to use the bridge, they can go directly to the send page. They can send, USDC from Polygon to layer 1. They don't even have to think about or know about what's going on with HUSDC under the hood. It just looks like this cross-chain AMM interface.
I wanted to pull it up, but I put it on the wrong screen. Yeah, so that makes total sense. So you basically have this messaging system that you've built that connects all of the different rollups that allows you to mint tokens, and effectively, as we learned before, minting and burning actually means like moving tokens between these different networks. But because you cannot do that with the native tokens themselves, like USDC and USDT, because you don't have control over them, they're not yours, they belong to other protocols or projects. You have basically created this token that is very similar to USDC or USDT and represents the same value, because people, in order to create this intermediary token, they have to lock the equivalent into the Hop system, if you want. And then so this token can be transferred easily between the networks. And then it can also be easily converted into the native equivalent in this AMM, the special AMM similar to Curve or Saddle that just where the tokens trade almost at par, so that this conversion doesn't cost anything. So when the end result is basically this, what we see here, right? like when I want to send 100 USDC from Polygon to XDAI, I send USDC and I get USDC. There's no hop token in between, and basically I get I pay 20 cents here of slippage, and then maybe 1 cent of gas cost. Whereas if I would go, from Polygon back to Ethereum, and then I'd have to wait 3 hours, and I'd pay $40 in gas, and then from Ethereum to XDAI, I'd pay another $30 in gas, and the whole thing would take a couple of transactions and 5 hours. Whereas here it's 30 cents.
Exactly, yeah. Polygon did actually speed up their bridge a bit, but it still takes 45 minutes an hour. And like you said, it would cost, $50, $60 in transaction fees.
And then the advantage gets even bigger when it's roll up to roll up, for example, because there the user would have to wait 7 days.
Exactly.
Okay, cool. Yeah, I think we got a good understanding now. One other question that someone asked me before this show basically is how does Hop compare to Connext, which is sort of the other player that in that that fast exit space, and that has been around for a long time. How would you say the two systems compare now that we have a good understanding of how Hop works?
Yeah, that's a good question. And so Hop uses this kind of cross-chain transfer approach where the assets actually move from one chain to the next, or the value actually moves from one chain to the next. Whereas Connext falls into this kind of atomic swap bucket where you're actually swapping value on one chain for value on the other chain. So with Hop, the liquidity provider provides liquidity and then gets liquidity where it's provided. With atomic swaps, the liquidity provider provides liquidity on one chain and then gets liquidity where the user originated.
It's more like a trade, whereas in the bonder is more like extending a short-term loan.
Exactly.
And gets it back at the same network that they also extended the loan.
Yeah. Okay. Exactly. And so with atomic swaps, it's difficult to not layer in any kind of reputation network or kind of trust with the router, because ultimately some party needs to initiate first. And so if it's the user, then the user is trusting the router to kind of fulfill their part. Or if it's the router, the user's trusting that the router will fulfill their part and basically not lock up the other one's funds for whatever the challenge period may be. And so if you could just kind of have completely unknown parties on both sides, then the system can be subject to a denial of service attack, where you basically have someone come in, since there's no reputation layer or anything like that, they can basically say, hey, initiate transfers with all the other participants, and all the other participants initiate these transfers and lock up funds. And so, this is stuff that people have written about with the Bitcoin Lightning Network and stuff like that, and ultimately why we chose, not to go down this route. But the big advantage of atomic swaps is that you don't really care if Ethereum can act as a hub. And so with Hop, we use this cross-domain message route to use Ethereum as kind of our, settlement layer and our messaging layer. Because of that, we can only support, scaling solutions that are built on Ethereum. So they already have these existing messaging bridges with Ethereum. Whereas if you're kind of taking this atomic swap approach, then you can connect completely disjointed chains and therefore could bridge to things like Binance Smart Chain, Solana, Polkadot, and so on. Ultimately with Hop, we do want to address this market, but it's not something we address right now. We're very focused on, just Ethereum's scaling solutions right now.
Which is a big enough market, right? If you look at, Polygon, XDAI, the rollups, or if you can already get that whole market, it's already nice enough. But obviously this is an advantage that you can connect any network. And so the advantages with Hop is that it's all on chain, it's all using smart contracts, so it's also more, say, interoperable. Other developers can hook into those smart contracts, build interesting stuff with it, and also more scalable. Ultimately, this with this approach of using the transfer routes and so on.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah, and it's definitely a big market, and we're really excited for Optimism's launch, for Arbitrum's launch, and also for some of these ZK rollups to start to become truly EVM compatible.
Yeah, that was actually my next question. So Because ZK rollups, I often hear from some experts that ZK rollups are actually the end game, that they are more powerful and faster and cheaper, but it just takes a longer time to get there until they're like fully live and fully EVM compatible. And that optimistic rollups, they're also really good, but they're not as good, and the advantage is just that they will be live earlier, so hopefully in a week or two, or sometime soon. But how do you and one of the advantages with ZK rollups is that supposedly the exit times are much shorter compared to the 7 days of an optimistic rollup. Something like a couple of hours. How do you think hop would be equally important and needed in a landscape where ZK rollups would be totally dominant?
Yeah, definitely. And so, one, I would say, these kind of early Ethereum users that were using layer 2, they were actually using ZK rollups, and it's still a problem if users have to kind of exit to layer 1 and can't go directly from one rollup to the next. Even if the rollup's exit time is pretty short, this is still a huge scalability problem. And ultimately, that's what we believe we're solving with Hop is in the short term. Yes, we can do this fast exit for optimistic rollups. This is a huge problem that we're solving here, but in the long term, especially if things move towards ZK rollups, where we see Hop fitting is just kind of being this messaging layer and value transfer layer that sits on layer 2, so that users can move across kind of a broad ecosystem of layer 2s and never have to touch layer 1. ZK rollups are kind of the holy grail. We love optimistic rollups today because they are fully EVM compatible. That we can use a lot of the same tools that we use. We can deploy the same sets of contracts really easily. They're basically here and ready today. Whereas ZK rollups, they're starting to roll out this kind of more generalized functionality. Sometimes it's fully EVM or close to EVM. Sometimes some of them have kind of their own languages. And then also, the exit times are immediate after a checkpoint. So the way you can think about the exit times of ZK rollups is it all depends on how quickly they checkpoint. Checkpointing ZK rollups is more expensive than optimistic rollup because you actually running this validity proof. So it actually runs the zero knowledge proof on chain, and that alone is pretty expensive. And so depending on the scale of the ZK rollup, it might checkpoint, really frequently or somewhat infrequently. And then once your transaction has made it into a checkpoint, you can exit. And so if a ZK rollup's only checkpointing, once a day, then it's going to be a pretty long exit time depending on where you are in that day. But if it's checkpointing, like say every block, which that seems pretty crazy. I don't think that's likely even for the most scaled ZK rollups. In that case, you can pretty much always exit immediately. And so ultimately, we'll see these ZK rollups develop. Eventually, they will be like kind of truly EVM compatible. We'll be able to use the same tools that we use with other, with layer 1 and optimistic rollups. And that's kind of when ZK rollups achieve this kind of holy grail where they don't have long exit times. They're fully EVM compatible. It's on paper, they're more scalable than optimistic rollups as well. So kind of that's the holy grail.
So ZK rollups, because of their the cost of submitting these checkpoints back on L1, it's quite expensive, these proofs. They won't, especially at the beginning, in the bootstrapping phase of these networks, they won't be able to do that constantly. So the exit times will actually be quite long. And even beyond that, assuming they will checkpoint very fast and exits are fast, it's still the end goal, as you said before, is still that users never have to go back to layer 1. So even if you have the option to go back to layer 1, it's not desirable, because then even entering a new ZK rollup or doing whatever else, an optimistic rollup, would be expensive again because it's at layer 1, and assuming that ETH price goes up and block space becomes even more scarce, it would be even more expensive than it is today. So even fast exit times aside, you still want like layer 2 to layer 2 interoperability.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
Okay, makes sense. Yeah, and one thing that we haven't discussed is, we kind of touched upon it, but like there's different ways that people can get involved, right? Like one is the bonder, right? Do you want to explain who can become a bonder and what the goal is in the long term like how many people could get involved in this role?
Sure. So there's basically two types of liquidity providers in Hop. So we kind of bucket these into like passive liquidity and active liquidity, where active requires, like running some like server process, some DevOps skills are involved, kind of like running an E2 node. And then being a passive liquidity provider is just participating in the AMM. So you just deposit your funds. It's more kind of set it and forget it. It doesn't require any kind of availability. And so, so with the Bonder, so that we can launch sooner rather than later, we're operating with a closed set of bonders for now. This is something that we want to be fully decentralized and open it up for that reason. And also, we only see the Hop network kind of really scaling up once we can, really open up this role and just like let anybody kind of come in and be a bonder without having to be a known party or anything like that. So that being said, within this closed set of bonders, the worst thing a bonder can do is be offline. They can't steal funds from users, and they basically can be offline, and then transfer that a user sends won't go through as fast as it would if the bonder was online. It would instead go through as slow as whatever, the layer 2's exit time is that they're sending from. Anyone that kind of is whitelisted can be a bonder today. And right now, the bonder requires running this off-chain process that basically runs full verifier nodes for each of the scaling solutions. And so that's what kind of gives it immediate finality, whereas like on-chain, like we talked about, you can't get that immediate finality. And then the bonder is just listening for events and then bonding transfers at the destination depending on those events. But it's a very automated process, kind of like running an ETH2 node. But in a future version of Hop, we hope in the very near term, we're going to open up this bonder role so that anyone can kind of come in, spin up the process and start bonding without needing any kind of permission or anything, much like running a ETH2 node.
And in the current setup, even though they're like the role, not anyone can become a bonder, so the role is not permissionless, it has to be whitelisted. The bonder doesn't have any power over users. The worst it can do is like going offline or deciding to not bond an individual transaction for whatever reason. But then Hop would just use the fallback, which is using the native bridge.
Exactly.
Okay. And then the second form of liquidity is like the passive liquidity, and that's what we see here in the interface that is available to everyone. And that is, this type of liquidity basically facilitates the conversions from these Hop intermediary tokens into the native tokens. So this is what allows the end user to receive the native token, and they earn swap fees for doing so. And one concern that people have or might have with this approach is like capital efficiency, right? Because like the bonder needs to lock up some liquidity on each of the destination chains in order to be able to front the liquidity, else there's no the user can't like withdraw. And then there's also some liquidity in the AMMs. So for each asset, there's a lot, everything is relative, but there's some capital being kind of locked up for the sole purpose of being able to transfer between networks. So I kind of like it for the main tokens like stablecoins and ETH, it makes a total sense. The need is so big to transfer these assets. So we see it already today with just two networks and two assets. There is demand for it. But what do you think about smaller projects that have, imagine, Indexed.Finance, DeFi 5, the biggest index had like $10 million in TVL. And like, do you think this could eventually also get liquidity on each of the destination networks on like Arbitrum and XDAI and so on?
So just to talk about the capital efficiency a little bit. So the way we think about it is that ultimately you need some stock of the tokens at the source and destination. So the user has to kind of deposit in at the source, and then there needs to be some funds available at the destination. And so that kind of is how we think about the AMM funds is that, that's the stock on hand, and that kind of idle capital is unavoidable because ultimately the stock is going to be the limit in terms of like how much you can bridge. And so we think of the kind of capital that the bonder holds as this is the inefficiency and the current hop version is any kind of collateral that the bonder is holding idle. This is where we see it improving. And so ultimately we want to decouple the asset that the bonder is facilitating the bridging of with the collateral that they're that they're locking up to kind of facilitate that bridge. And so once we can kind of decouple those two assets, then what we could see is the bonder can then use any form of collateral. And this could also include productive assets, such as like vault positions and stuff like that, where now all of the inefficiencies of that kind of idle capital is no longer idle. And therefore all of the inefficiencies of the bonder's capital are kind of alleviated. And then that way, the only idle capital is in the AMMs itself. And we see that as kind of optimal capital efficiency.
Okay, that is amazing. So that means basically the bonder could put interest-bearing tokens as collateral, such as, for example, staked ETH or ADAI, and then it would be much less inefficient. So basically, the bonder's funds are actually just collateral. They're not really used for giving the user the funds that they need. It's actually just a security in order for the bonder to be able to mint a certain amount of H tokens, HUSDC, for example. They only have the right to do that, this minting, right, if they have also the corresponding collateral to actually back this up. And so this collateral can be anything.
Yeah, that's exactly right. The bonder is basically attesting that something happened on some other chain, and they're locking up some collateral that backs up that attestation. And as long as they're not, as long as we wait long enough, and then we can prove that they're not lying, and then free up their collateral. And so that collateral could really be any asset and doesn't necessarily need to be tied to the asset that they're bridging. Okay,
that is amazing. I think, that frees up really a whole space of possibilities of awesome things you can do, right? Especially knowing how creative DeFi developers are. I can imagine the wildest things. But I mean, the collateral needs to be quite safe. Probably this would be then decided very prudently what is good collateral and what is not, right? By the way, we have also like there's a chat functionality. So if there are some questions, we'll take them in a couple of minutes. Until now, it just comments like, I love the UI, which is nice, and plans for a token. So let's not take those. But if there's any viewers that have some questions, now is the time. Meanwhile, what are the plans for the near future? You said the focus is on all the EVM chains, like rollups, side chains, like Polygon, XDAI, but you're hinting at maybe in the future also connecting other L1s. So Solana comes to mind, or Terra, like powerful ecosystems, but that are not really part of Ethereum today. What is the technical limitation that dictates whether that can be done or not?
Yeah, so just take a stab at the roadmap really quick. So super near term, we're looking at supporting more assets, and then also more solutions like Arbitrum and Optimism. Then beyond that, we'll be scaling to kind of other EVM compatible chains. And then in the more intermediate term, we're going to be really focused on expanding just beyond token transfers and actually doing cross-chain contract calls. And so that will enable some really, really interesting types of kind of like cross-scaling solution composability, where you could actually transfer tokens to one chain, have it do a swap, and then have them transfer themselves back. You can do cross-chain governance, and you could deposit into vaults and just tap into liquidity on different scaling solutions. So that's something we're really excited about. And then also mentioned kind of like decoupling the bonder asset, that collateral asset from what's being bridged. And so that's kind of like what we're focused on, the intermediate term. And then in the long term, ultimately we do want to address kind of this cross, addressing bridging disjointed layer ones. And this is definitely going to be an area of research and development. So there's basically a few approaches that we could do. And the most likely one is probably going to be introducing some new validator set, similar to something like Thorchain does, or what Compound's chain is going to do, where you have some validator set that is kind of attesting to actions on some other chain, attesting to actions on Ethereum and Ethereum scaling solutions. In that way is able to kind of facilitate the bridging of assets. But yeah, that being said, it's something we're going to be doing a lot of research and thinking on, and it could shake out in many different ways.
That sounds all exciting.
Yeah, that sounds good. And yeah, if you're looking to get involved, jump in the Discord. We're on Twitter, and we'll be announcing stuff through there. And then if you're a developer and you're interested in working on this kind of thing, we're definitely looking for help. So if you're interested in joining the Hop team, don't hesitate to reach out.
Oh yeah, actually, now that you said this, one question that people also often ask is like, when can you enable a new network like Optimism and Arbitrum? Is that just on the Hop side to decide basically when that happens, or does it need to be some whitelisting from the Optimism or Arbitrum team respectively?
Yeah, so right now, Optimism and Arbitrum aren't completely open networks. That's definitely their goal, but it's not quite there yet. So right now, we're just waiting on the thumbs up from those teams to be live on mainnet.
Yeah, I can't wait for that. I think that's when the real fun will start with Hop.
Yeah.
Awesome. Thanks, Chris. Thanks for your time.
Thanks for having me on, Lita. Good to talk to you.